Hi, Gino. Thank you for joining again. All right, good morning, Texas. How's it going? Fabulous. Okay. Okay. Okay, so it's 10:30 for me, so I'm gonna get started. If you guys, I see there's some more of you on the page. If you could still just send a chat, say hi. This is a live stream, so it's a one-way broadcast. If you don't talk to me, I'm not gonna be able to talk to you, which maybe you want that. That's fine. But if you could go ahead and say hello in the chat, I'd appreciate it. And I'll give you a brief introduction about myself while we wait for a few more people to join, and then we'll get going. So hello, my name's Bridget. I'm a photographer. I've been working and living in New York City for the past 8 years. Before that, I was earning my degree in photography from the Savannah College of Art and Design. I've tried a lot of niches because I couldn't really find one that I wanted to stick to. So I've been behind the scenes at New York Fashion Week and also in front taking photos of the catwalk. I've done a lot of music concert photos inside venues and also at festivals. I've also worked with private clients for portraiture, families, events, weddings, etc. And I've helped small businesses do branding and more photos for their websites. And I've even gotten some images up on advertising spaces in the New York City subway system. Currently, I am pursuing being a photo educator, hence the class today, and fine art photography. I think I fell in love with photography because it was a lot easier for me to take a photo and tell a story than to write it. Even with, essays being such a big part of classes in high school, I always felt like I could communicate better when I took a photo. I love that about photography, that you can still take a good photo without as much technical practice as drawing or painting. And so what I want to do when I offer these classes is I want to try to encourage everyone to create and to take photos for fun. But I think we all know that a good-looking photo is better than one that doesn't look so good. And some of that's subjective, but there are ways where we can consciously make a photo look better, be more attractive, and tell the story that we want it to tell. So this is why I wanted to talk about composition and the elements of composition in a photo. I'm going to go over what is composition, just a brief definition, elements of art, and that would apply to all art, not just photos, the elements of composition that are more geared towards photography, and we're going to touch throughout the presentation about story in an image. I am not going to be watching the chat all the time, but I do have my friend Robin here. She's graciously volunteered her time this morning to watch the chat for us. So hopefully, if you guys do have questions, as you have them, just put them in the chat. I might not get to them until the end, but I am going to try to remember to take breaks in between each section and answer your questions. Okay, so first off, a basic definition of composition, it's what's in the photo. It's what you are choosing to include as a subject and the elements in a photograph, but also how they're laid out and how they work together. You might hear a composition be described as static or dynamic, and that's related to the intended effect or influence on the viewer. A photo is a conversation between you, the photographer, and your audience, the people seeing the work. It's a story, and how you compose it is how you're telling it. So that's why your photo of the Empire State Building is going to be different than mine, because you're seeing it different and you're experiencing it differently. The basic 7 elements of art, and I'm taking this from what I learned in formal education and also hearing from mentors and professors and coworkers, is line, space, form, shape, color, texture, and value. How do these translate to photography? Well, like texture and form, they can be suggested, but in reality, because a photo is flat, it's either printed or it's on a screen, texture and form don't truly apply because they're not physical elements. Does that make sense? Like if you touch a photo, you're touching the paper. You're not touching the texture of the grass. And form in art really does apply more to sculpture or like a carved relief. But you can imply them in photography. So I'm going to talk about them as subsets of focal point and shape. So line, space, color, and value, and shape are more attributable to photographs, and they're areas that are open for critique. So if you got your portfolio reviewed or you wanted feedback on your photos, those are areas where people will say, okay, this is how I think the lines are playing into your photo, the shapes, color, etc. In addition to line, space, color, value, shape, photos, we should consider rule of thirds, and in that, like how you're balancing, do you create symmetry or asymmetry in your image? Point of view, framing, and focal point. Now, all of these elements are used in conjunction. You're not going to have a photo that only uses one of these elements. Some photos will emphasize one more than another, and the photographer is going to choose what elements are emphasized. So first we're going to start with space. A brief definition is space is the area between and around objects. Most often, it's broken down into positive or negative space. In a photograph, the perceived distance between subjects in the photo is also part of space. It's the illusion of depth and the environment that you're in. So for this photo, this is a wide open space. I think we can feel that. Part of how we feel that and understand that is the figure that we're drawn to, the male body, is very small, right, compared to the rest of the image. He's taking up a very small portion of the whole canvas or the whole photo. Over on the right-hand side with him and that graffiti wall, that's the positive space because it's activated. There's contrast, there's detail. Our eye is automatically drawn to that, especially with the two vertical lines kind of plonking us down and looking at that. The other half, the left-hand side, that would be negative space. We would see it, and yes, there's dirt in there, but visually it's empty, okay? So that's more of the negative space on the left-hand side. The positive is on the right. Now, in creating space in this photo, this is a wider angle because we're open, we're wide, and we can see more of the space, keeping the figure small. Also lends to the, how am I trying to say this? Also lends to the vastness of the space, right? Because we're using the small figure and comparing it to the bigger area. Had I chose to zoom in and crop in and just get that positive space, we'd get a different feel because we don't feel the abyss or expanse of the old warehouse that we're in. Compared to this image where the background and the figure feel very close to each other. We feel like we're in a tight space because the elements are closer together, meaning that background, that wall, and the figure. Also, the composition is a lot tighter. There's still positive and negative space here, the negative space being on top, right? And visually it's empty, even though there is a wall and the texture. Visually, we would feel and say that it's empty, versus with the figure down at the bottom. So those are two, I use these two examples just to compare, like you can get a feeling of wide open space or vast space, or you can get a feeling of tight, closed-in space. Okay, do we have any questions about shape? No, okay. Boop, boop, boop. All right, so the next element is color and value. I'm putting them together, and I'll explain why in a second. I'm not going to define what color is, but it is the key descriptions of color are hue, value, intensity or saturation, true white, and true black in relation to photography. So colors have neighborly relationships. If we're thinking of the color wheel when it comes to paints and pigments, they can be complementary, which would mean they're found across from each other on the color wheel, or they can be analogous, so they're next to each other on the color wheel. And if you're going back to kindergarten, remember your primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. And then value would refer to how dark or light a color is. And value would replace color for black and white photography, which is why I kind of think of them and lump them together, because photography does have a history of being colorless, right? So you can't look at a black and white daguerreotype and try to judge it for its color or lack thereof. We're looking at tones and values and seeing how the very bright parts and the dark parts can be used to create emotion or draw focus somewhere. And you can do that with different values of color, but just also black and white photography, you're only looking at value or the tones. Be mindful when you're using color, it strongly affects the emotional reaction of the viewer, and there's symbolic meaning attached to color as well. So I like to think of red. I know for me, I think growing up, I mostly associated red with passion, right? So either romantic or anger, kind of like a power, right? But I know, for Chinese New Year, red is a color of good luck, and that's in fortune. So you can have different cultural associations, and you can also have different emotional reactions to color. Color can be its own class and course when it comes to art and photography, but also just a caveat here and keep in mind, the color wheel I have on the screen and what I typically use when I'm thinking of relationships and colors in photo is coming from the pigment color wheel and relationship. If you mix pigments like paint, if you mix them all together, you're going to get a brown or a black. But photo does use light, and if you mix all the different visible light rays together, right, you get white. So that doesn't really matter when you're going to take a photo. If you want to include analogous colors like blue and green, that's great. But if you notice when you're editing, like if you're editing color temperature, that yellow and blue are actually the opposite and complementary colors for when you're doing color temperature. Green and magenta, which we could kind of say is like a closer to a purple, are opposite complementary colors. And then we have red and cyan. So it's a little bit different. There's a little bit of different relationship between colors in terms of light and colors when we're looking at pigments. But I think when you're looking at a photograph, the emotional and kind of subconscious symbolic meaning of color is more important rather than those relationships. If that doesn't make sense, put it in the chat, let me know. But as a basic introduction to color, we're really more concerned with the emotional impact and the subconscious relationship between the viewer and the color. So for the example, these are the same photo. I took them maybe seconds apart, and all I did was I changed my white balance on the camera because that's going to change the color. It's going to change what the camera reads as absolute or pure white and absolute pure black. But I think just changing the overall color of the image, we get a very different feel and message through the photos. So the one on the right-hand side, that's auto color balance. This was taken just after sunset in the evening. I'm getting a little bit more of like an ominous, kind of like a storm on the horizon, since over on the right-hand side of this photo, it's getting darker and we see clouds just kind of creeping up over the buildings. The strong diagonal line is leading us down that path. And I think the really dark tones and values the houses, that's also kind of lending to this sense of a storm coming down. Whereas the one where I adjusted the white balance and it's bluer, to me that I feel like I'm walking through a dream, or maybe that it's even morning, right? Like a peaceful morning, like the clouds at night are going away. The blue is calming and soothing, and because the blue is affecting how the black is reading, it's not as intense and not as dark. So I think the mood kind of lightens. And so that's an example of how changing color and using color strategically is going to change the mood of your photograph. Okay, shape. So shape is defined as a closed line. You can have basic shapes, geometric shapes like circle, square, triangle. You can have organic or curved shapes. So if you drew a squiggle and we call that a blob, that'd be an organic shape. And then there's implied shapes. So they're not technically a closed line, but our eyes, our brain is reading it for us, like Gestalt design principle. So on the, over here, the 3 Pac-Men example, the actual shapes are the 3 little Pac-Men. But the way they're facing each other, our brain is filling in the gap and saying, hey, there's a triangle in the middle of those 3 circles. Now, this is also, I lump form and shape together because photographs, we harness light and gradients from our shadows, our darks to our highlights, and those can be used to imply form. So if you look at that drawing of the sphere down there, that is a flat picture, but our mind is reading it as a ball because of how we're using the light and the gradient to imply form. It will give you a feeling of depth or mass. So keep that in mind if you want your photo to look a little bit flatter versus deeper. An example of how we're looking at shapes. So this is a multiple exposure, and it's playing a little bit on one of the figure-ground relationships where it's, you know, I had it on the last slide. Do you see a vase first, or do you see 2 faces? So it's playing on that a little bit. But we can break it down into even more basic shapes, right? This is my freehand mouse drawing on the picture. But you can see like the head, that dark spot, it's its own oval. Like we can see that where the shadows and the dark tones, there's almost another oval on top of the outline of the head. And then the way that the shoulders touch and that dress kind of draws our eye, there's a triangle at the bottom. So it looks like an egg balancing on the point of a triangle. And then I just filled in the sides because we would also consider that background where it's grayer and the darker, and the figure, not darker in all parts, but the figure's contrasted on the background. We would also consider that its own shape. Okay, so line is really big in photography because we're going to think about lines that are actually present in the photo, lines that we can see, and then we're also going to think about implied lines in photography. Lines can create textures and patterns, which are ways that we can draw focus into a certain part of the image. And then we also have leading lines in a photograph. So these, again, can be visible or not, but they're the lines that the eyes follow through an image. So this can influence how a photo is read. In America, we read a book like left to right, right? And I'm just saying that because I'm here in New York. And so naturally, we will go to look at a photo and we will try to read it the same way. We'll start at the left, go to the right. Leading lines can kind of break up that natural path, and if you want your viewer to go to a certain part of the image first, you can use leading lines as well as, we'll talk about, sorry, there's a dog. You can use leading lines, or we'll talk about focal point in a little bit and creating contrast points or where you focus your camera. Right, and then also we need to be mindful of the horizon line in a photo. This is the perceived horizon or ground line, and that's going to be used as a comparison for whether your image is straight or crooked. Your horizon line does not have to be straight, but when you do have the horizon line in there, be mindful if you don't want your picture to look crooked, you need to straighten your horizon line. Again, like organic lines, they're the curves, visible or implied. We're using them to create perspective and depth. So you can either have it going straight horizontal through an image, that's going to lead you from left to right. But if you have diagonals, it'll make you feel like there's more space in your composition because it's going to look like you can see into the distance, right? Some lines will have their own subconscious influence on the viewer. So horizontal lines are serenity because they're stable. Vertical lines are power, like a lightning bolt or a very strong, tall tree. And diagonal lines usually imply action, whether it's a path traveled or what have you. So I have a couple of images. I've outlined the lines in the image. So in this one, the fabric is creating its very own organic curved line. And because it's at a slight diagonal, we have the closest part, the foreground, over on that left-hand side, and then we follow it towards the back. Now, if I had made it even more diagonal, if I changed, right, my composition, so it wasn't just like a little bit of difference between what's in the front and back, but really exaggerated it, we would feel like it's more dynamic. Our eye is going to feel like it's moving further through the picture. Then also the tree there and the figure, they're kind of crossing that diagonal with very strong vertical lines. So you don't get lost going back into the photo, but you are, that diagonal line is cut with the tree and you focus on the figure. This image uses lines. It's not really drawing us back, but they're leading lines. I feel like our eye kind of goes around in a circle a little bit, right? So there's that point where these lines kind of all meet up in that upper left corner, and then you can follow them around. This is a mirror that I'm shooting through. You can follow them around the reflection lines in the mirror as well as the lines of the table. But those would be the lines that are present in this picture, and you could even go and add like the lines of the flowers or the curve of the plates, etc. All right. Okay, so rule of thirds. I think lines, rule of thirds, I mean, they all go hand in hand, but I think lines and rule of thirds, they're the things that I think about the most when I'm going to take a photo. Rule of thirds does typically refer to us weighting our subjects off center or at like the cross point of these grids. So the rule of thirds is typically a 3x3 grid, 9 squares. On most cameras, if you do want to practice, you can shoot with one as a practice guide. I don't just use the rule of thirds or think of rule of thirds as putting my subject off center. I use rule of thirds to think about what to include or exclude in my composition based on what's going to fit in the grid pleasingly, and is it going to balance my main subject? Is it going to add to it or take away? So where does the surrounding environment to your focal point fit in the grid? Is it all going to get scrunched together into one square? Would that be interesting? Can you include something else to balance your subject? Or should you exclude other things that are around your subject because they're detracting? Okay, so like this photo almost completely perfectly fits on the rule of thirds grid. The Space Needle, the big, that saucer at top almost like sits perfectly where the grid's lines are crossing. and then all the buildings fit in that lower third, right? So we have a very strong implied horizon line with the buildings and the clouds back there and the ground. And then we have this tall tower like jutting out. I chose to keep that building on the right in frame because to me it visually balances, and it gives us a grounding point in the image. I thought to crop it, it was just your eye kind of goes whoop and leaves the frame. So I liked having that building on the end. This one isn't so obvious, right? When it comes to rule of thirds, like you wouldn't really say that the subject is weighted off center because this whole frame is activated. There's not a lot of negative space, right? So a lot of it's activated. But over on the grid, if you think about it as like 3 vertical parts, the left and right vertical parts of the 3/3 grid, you have a lot going on. You have the figure, and then you have that shelf, but then you have the horizontal lines of the shelf kind of coming in and activating those conjunction points on the grid. So you can also just use rule of thirds thinking about like, hey, how am I dividing up my frame? Where's everything going to go? How am I going to fit what I want to fit into the picture? There's other grids that you could use to think about how you're going to compose an image. I am going to email a list of links to articles that I used to refresh myself for this presentation. One of them is on the SLR Lounge, Goodbye Rule of Thirds. And there's a photo that they use there that Annie Leibovitz took. And right off the bat, you could say, like, hey, I totally see how she's using rule of thirds. I see she's got like 3 groups of women. Awesome. Looks great. But if you overlay this dynamic symmetry grid, you will see that Annie actually used her poses for the women, that the lines of their body actually go along this grid, if not perfectly, near perfectly. So she added that on top of rule of thirds and gave a little bit more, I don't want to say depth, but just a little bit more of interest for the photo and the way that we read and moved through it with our eyes. And of course, golden ratio is also completely great to use. There's other things too, like radial symmetry, perfect symmetry, etc. Okay. All right, point of view. So think about where is your camera height-wise compared to your subject. There's other ways to think of point of view as well, but think about where your camera is height-wise. Like this web camera is about eye level. If we take a picture and we're lower and looking up, that's ground level, or like a worm's eye view. And then, of course, if we're taking it from the top down, common way to say that is bird's eye view. Think about how you want your subject to be portrayed, how you want the viewer to feel in relationship to that subject. If you're looking up at a subject, it's going to feel massive and dominating. So if you're walking through New York City and you're just in awe by how tall the buildings are, and you feel so small, like going down a big avenue with these skyscrapers on either side, a way to convey that in your image, get down really close to the ground, as close as you can, or feel comfortable, and point your camera up with a wide angle. The buildings are going to seem massive. They're going to seem like they're growing and shooting into the sky, right? If you look down on your subject, which is another viewpoint, it could be condescending, but it could also look more like the viewer is outside, like we're kept outside and we're separated from what's going on in the scene, right? Like we're some deity looking down from the heavens onto what these little people are doing. The scale will change with the point of view. So again, like you can make a subject feel bigger or smaller than what it actually is based on where your camera set, your point of view. Focal length will also play into that a little bit, and that's where we get forced perspective. Think of like those photos of someone where it looks like they're holding up the Leaning Tower of Pisa. That's a forced perspective. And the point of view is typically you're further away from the subject, which is part of it too, probably getting a little bit lower. And your person is very close to the camera, whereas the tower is actually very far away. Just a couple of examples, like using point of view where it's not terribly obvious, like you're not in an airplane looking down or looking up from the bottom of a hole. The first one with that, with the model, I'm standing up on top of the rock and I'm looking down to kind of get, I think her body got more elongated and we got different proportions with her figure by me looking down. And it was also just something different to do for a portrait shoot versus the other one where I'm down on the ground and I'm looking up at the house. And that's a swing in the front that's kind of moving in front of the camera. But the lines created from the trees and also the verticals of the house that are now like kind of bending back, they help draw your eye up in this point of view. Okay, the next one is framing. We're not talking about framing your work to hang on a wall. We're talking about using an element in the foreground or the closest part of the picture to your camera, which is going to draw attention to another part of the image. And it will also help add depth. The most successful frames are relevant to the subject or the story, right? So they're going to add to it. They're going to give some context or a clue. They're not just going to be thrown in for fun, although I do like just throwing in frames for fun. I actually love using mirrors and other reflective surfaces to frame. So the picture that I showed you of the tea party that got knocked over, I taped together 3 mirrors and was shooting through that to get more of like a kaleidoscope in-camera collage effect. These are 2 examples of framing. So the first one on the left, again, that's the Space Needle, and I'm using the leaves to frame the tower. And I'm going to take a moment to talk about here, comparing this picture of the Space Needle, to the one I showed on the rule of thirds. They are both pictures of the same subject, but they're telling very different sides of my experience with the Space Needle and the city of Seattle. So the first one, I'm out on a ferry, kind of doing a little sightseeing tour, and I took that photo looking back at the city. So I wasn't engaged in actual Seattle, I was just looking at it. Here, I was so impressed and just loved how green Seattle was, especially compared to New York. I loved that there was so much nature, whether I'm looking out and I'm seeing Mount Rainier or, driving around the suburbs. It was so green and I loved it. So I used this chance, the composition, to include the green of Seattle with one of its iconic landmarks. The framing for this photo also, if you follow along, the leaves are kind of giving us, I don't know what that was, leaves are kind of giving us a curve, and they're surrounding the saucer of that Space Needle. And I think it kind of leads us up and around and just kind of hugs the building. The framing for these flowers on the right-hand side, I'm actually shooting through another dried flower itself. And you can't really tell because it's so close to the lens. It's the depth of field. It's only focusing on the flowers. But it's creating just this little sliver of a composition. And then we have the color fields on either side. So in this one, I'm also using a frame to create negative space and adding a little bit more interest to the photo. I love framing, if you can't tell. It's one of my favorites. Okay, focal point. I know I've been talking for a while, but thank you for bearing with me. We're getting to like the Q&A. Focal point, what you choose to focus on with your camera settings, right? So the first part of setting a focal point, the first way to do it is just, what are you going to choose with your camera or with your phone to set as in focus? A focal point is also where an eye is drawn to in the image. So something that is in focus and sharp versus something blurry and out of focus, our eye will get drawn to that first. But it's getting drawn to that because when something is in focus, there are more details and that's more contrast, right? So high contrast areas are also focal points. So that could just be a clump of texture, like a very dramatically lit grass, right? Can have a lot of highlights and shadows, a lot of contrast, and that can be a focal point. Textures and patterns are high contrast, so they can draw you to them, as well as eyes. Like if you're taking a picture of a person or an animal, we are going to be drawn to the eyes first. So typically that is what we want in focus, if nothing else, when we're taking portraits. Again, photos are read in the same direction as text without leading lines to create a path. And leading lines should be bringing you to focal points. If you have more space around your focal point, it will be used to give context to your subject. Going back to rule of thirds, what do we include in the image with our subject, or what we want to photograph, right? These are a couple of examples of focal points. So the first one on the left with the mushrooms, this is a very shallow depth of field. I'm down on the ground for perspective, and I'm just focusing on the mushroom. But because that plant is on the same focal plane as that mushroom, we have a little bit of detail on the left. So we do kind of move with the curve of the little branches up through the image and coming back on the mushroom, even though our eye kind of waits and sets there. Does that make sense? And then just another example of a focal point using eyes to kind of really draw your attention. There's a lot going on. There's a lot burning in this photo, and it's interesting, and we think, what's happening here? But we are most drawn to, and we are staying with the eyes of the model in that image. Okay. Okay, relationship of elements and subjects. So I said this before in the beginning. Photographs tell a story, and your composition is your unique story. I showed you two photos that I took of the Space Needle. They're both very different. Same subject, but they're both very different. They're telling different interactions, different stories with that subject. Everyone can take a photo, and your view comes through when you make the choices of where you're putting a subject, what you zoom in and include in a photo, or if you stay wide, and how all the elements discussed here today are included in your image. But think about what you're experiencing and why you're taking a photo. We can pay attention to these elements even if we're just shooting with a phone or another automatic camera. You can choose the perspective you're taking your photo at. You can get lower, you can get higher. You can try to move around the frame. Okay, I'm looking at something head on, but should I try moving to the side? Do I like, the profile of the subject more than I like the face-to-face? Think about how you're relating to the scene in front of you before you take a picture. Even if you're just walking through a park and you see a tree and you're like, hey, that's a nice tree. I want to take a picture. That's why you're taking the photo. You want to share how pretty that tree is. You want to share that tiny little moment of joy you had when you saw a pretty tree, right? Now, what's the best way to do that? You have to decide for yourself. What do you love about the tree? Do you love the tiny details of the flowers? Well, then maybe you want to get close up and take a picture of the flowers on the branches. Do you love how it's really bright and colorful and compared to, a blank green field that's around it? So maybe you want to stay back and get that one lone tree with its flowers in the middle of a green field. Does that make sense? We're talking about elements and stuff, and there's some other tips to talk about for composition. Watching the edges of your image. Try not to have anything distracting or creating tension. Like if you were taking a picture of a mountain, you don't want the point to be right on the edge of the frame. Usually, you want to give it some breathing room. Same with taking pictures of people. You don't want the head right at the top of the frame. You want to give it some breathing room. If you do want to break this rule a little bit, go look up Arnold Newman. He was a fashion photographer and also pioneered environmental portraits. And he would purposely use elements on the edges of his photographs to kind of balance, like the way I chose to leave that one building on my rule of thirds photo with the Space Needle. Remember your horizon line. It should not, I don't want to say should, try not to have it in the middle of your photo. So if you have a horizon, try to weight it in the bottom or weight it in the top of your frame. It might just, be a more interesting way to break up the scene. But of course, I'm giving you these tips. Feel free to break the rules. It's fine. And I think the more you experiment and try to take it the way that it's suggested to take a photo, doing that plus breaking the rules and testing out what you prefer, I think that'll really help you find your own style and creative side in photography. If you are symmetry is very appealing. We didn't really talk about it too much when I talked about rule of thirds, but symmetry is always really appealing. So if you have a perfectly balanced image where it's almost like a mirror reflected, that's always very pleasing. And rule of thirds or not. Back to taking pictures of people. If you're going to take a picture of a person, watch how you're cropping the body. You can take a photo and we can look at it and say, why does it feel off? Generally, if you're cropping an image at a joint, like at the wrist, at the neck, at an elbow, our mind kind of says like, hey, something should be connecting there. Where's the rest of that limb? And so it could look a little bit off in your image. That's the general rule of thumb. Try not to crop at a joint. So if you want to do a bust shot, try to crop it like mid-arm, not at the shoulder, at the neck, or at the elbow. And same with, knees, ankles, etc. And my advice to pushing your composition so that your images don't all look the same, and how you can try to find your own unique viewpoints, is to try taking different compositions of the same subject. Go out, find a tree. Take 10, 20, 50 different pictures of that tree. Get close to it. Get far away. Face it head on. Take 20 paces, walk around to the other side, take another photo. Try looking up at it. Try climbing up a branch and looking down, etc. If you want to practice getting more interesting compositions, just keep taking photos of the same thing and seeing how you can get different photos every time of the same subject.
Someone asked what the photographer's name was.
What the photographer's... Okay, someone asked the name of the photographer I mentioned, Arnold Newman. I'll look it up. If I don't look it up right now when we're going into Q&A, I'll send it along in the email to follow up. But Arnold Newman, I think Newman is Newmann. One N. Nope. One N. Okay. I'm going to send out this slideshow in the email afterwards with a survey and a link to a recording. But these are some resources that I use to refresh myself. And that's it. Thank you. Okay, we stayed about at 45 minutes. That's great. Practice paid off. I'm sorry I talked for so long. I would really love it if you guys would stay in touch. I hope this was helpful to you and encouraging for you to go out and take some of your own photos. I run a Facebook group called Imperfect Photography. Once a week we try to pick like the photo of the week, and I try to share tutorials and articles that I find discussing the artistic side of photography. And I have another class coming up in March. The one in March, there is a ticket fee, but if you use the code IMPERFECT, IMPRFT, you get it for 50% off. I am going to keep doing classes like this, and most of them will be free online. I'm going to do it once a month. That's the plan right now. So please also follow me on Eventbrite. Feel free to reach out with questions anytime. I'm happy to help if I can. My email is bridget@bhaggerty.com, and you're already on my website. It's bhaggerty.com. And I'm going to get into, I think we have some more questions in the chat. So I'm going to get into that now. And please, like, if you have any other questions, even if it's not something we talked about today, feel free to throw it in there too.